So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Davis.
Thank you for inviting me to come here and talk today. It's always a treat to come and talk to producers. It's going to be hard to follow Dr. Mullenix. I'm not an extension agent. I don't work with producers on a regular basis. I'm a research scientist. So I do have the opportunity to work with a lot of producers in research, and I'm very excited to share with you the research that we're doing today. And there's actually a few people in this room that are integral to that research, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And so as Dr. Van Valen said, I study red clover as one of my principal areas as part of my work with the Forage Animal Production Research Unit. And specifically today, we're going to talk a little bit about how this red clover in different applications can work into backgrounding systems, either as it relates to weight gain, but also mitigating or preventing fescue toxicosis. So I want to start out with a concept kind of going back to human nutrition of functional foods. And so our unit, one of our mission areas is developing phytochemical alternatives to conventional antibiotics that you might use in cattle production due to a lot of limitations related to that. And so when we think about functional foods in human nutrition, we're talking about foods that provide a health benefit that's beyond basic nutrition. So not just protein or energy. They have something else, a bioactive food component or compound that confers an additional benefit. And so oftentimes we think of these as nutraceuticals or superfoods or food as medicine. And so one example of that is fatty fish. If you eat 2 servings a week, it's supposed to help prevent heart disease. So a very small portion of your diet that contains a phytochemical or a nutrient, a specific nutrient that confers a health benefit. And so why am I talking about human nutrition? Well, that's because in animals, we're also utilizing these concepts of functional feeds. And this is something that is already in products everywhere. You know, you see these compounds integrated in your minerals or in your feed supplements. So how does this translate to animal nutrition and health? So we have feeds that contain bioactive compounds that confer animal production and health benefits, like preventing fescue toxicosis or improving weight gain, that when they're consumed regularly as part of the diet or in small proportions of the diet, can give you a health benefit or a production benefit. So it's distinct from a feedstuff. It's not just providing crude protein or energy. It's providing this additional benefit. So there are a lot of these different functional feeds that are included in supplements that you may already be familiar with. So cinnamon byproducts might be present in your mineral. Garlic, capsaicin from red peppers is in minerals to prevent things like fescue toxicosis already. So this is already being used typically in livestock production. But what about functional forages? What about our pastures? So there are a lot of things present in a pasture, right? There's a lot of different things that we might consider a good grass or a weed, but they all contain these phytochemicals. So they all give crude protein and energy, but they also have other things. And so bird's foot tree foil and Serratia lespedeza, as well as black locust trees and silvopastures, have been shown to contain compounds like tannins and other phytochemicals that can combat things like fescue toxicosis or change rumen fermentation and improve average daily gain. And then we also have other legumes like clovers or alfalfa that have been used. And today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about clovers, but I want you to kind of think of, your pasture as this suite of opportunity, not just to provide nutrients, but also to provide maybe some of these added benefits. So why do we use clovers? So some of the obvious and most familiar reasons would be reducing nitrogen inputs on our pastures, as Dr. Mullenix talked about, improving pasture quality by increasing protein and digestibility, improving forage diversity, which has been shown to improve animal performance as well. But what I want to talk about as it relates to clover is their functional food potential applications. So legumes, most notably red clover because they're at very high levels, contain bioactive isoflavones. And so these isoflavones are a component that's part of the flavonoid family. They can be antioxidants. They're also phytoestrogenic, so we worry about them a little bit in terms of reproduction. But they also have two benefits that our research team has worked on quite a bit, and that includes growth promotion, and we're going to talk about that a little bit today just to start, but also as a vasorelaxant in preventing fescue toxicosis. So when we talk about these isoflavones as it relates to growth promotion, they are what we call antimicrobial growth promoters. And so some of those that you might be familiar with or might have included on your farms before would be things like Rumensin or Bovatec. And so obviously the Veterinary Feed Directive has put a lot of regulation on the use of these antibiotics. So like I said, our unit focuses on finding phytochemical alternatives. And so antimicrobial growth promoters are an antibiotic or another antibacterial agent that selectively kills certain bacteria in the rumen, which allows nutrients to be utilized more efficiently and improves gain or feed efficiency. And so that's how Rumensin and Bovatec work, and how I'm going to show you how these isoflavones might also provide that same benefit. And so what makes cattle unique, right? They can turn fiber from grass into meat or into milk or whatever their production outcome that you're looking for is. And so they consume pasture. They're out there grazing the pasture. That pasture is consumed, that forage, and it makes it into the rumen where it's first digested by this big group of rumen bacteria. And so these bacteria take all of these different components of the pasture and turn them into acids that the animal can absorb to meet their energy requirements. And so this process is what makes our cattle unique and what makes them particularly efficient on grazing in grazing systems. And so what red clover does, and those isoflavones and red clover can do, is they stop wasteful protein fermentation, and so they kill bacteria that waste protein. So when protein enters into the rumen, most of it's actually wasted because the bacteria don't need it that much. So we try to increase bypass protein, and these isoflavones can do that. They also improve fiber utilization. So again, like I said, the most important function of cattle, or what makes them unique, is that they can utilize fiber, and these isoflavones make them even more efficient at doing so. And so this translates to increased energy for the animal, and consequently we can see a 24 to 30% increase in average daily gain just by supplementing some red clover or isoflavones in the diet. So what happens to these isoflavones after they go through the rumen and have these antimicrobial growth promotion benefits? So when they're in the rumen, they're modified by those bacteria. They'll digest just about anything, and they are absorbed, where they enter the blood, and they can have a wide variety of effects on the animal from that point, one of them being decreased hypertension, or essentially they're a vasorelaxant. And so that applies as we think about fescue toxicosis. So many of you, I'm sure everyone in this room, has either a personal experience or knows about fescue toxicosis and the concern specifically for our region. So there's 86 million acres of tall fescue in the United States, 5.5 million acres just here in Kentucky, and it's said to cost as much as $2 billion to the U.S. beef industry annually, just in losses of production related to this. And so this can range anywhere from lost animals with severe fescue toxicosis that have to be culled, or even just loss in gains related to fescue toxicosis. And so when animals consume tall fescue that's infected with an endophyte that produces ergot alkaloids, the animal has vasoconstriction, and so these ergot alkaloids bind receptors in the system that cause their blood flow to be reduced. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So this can have a variety of effects on the animal. You can have really severe cases where you see things like fescue foot or tail switches coming off related to that, but more often you see animals that are just standing in a mud puddle. They're having trouble dissipating heat. There's a lot of heat stress related issues with fescue toxicosis that translates to reduced average daily gain. And so I always like to talk about this and first present the history of our unit. So our unit has been tasked with fighting fescue toxicosis for years and years and years, certainly before I ever worked here. And so I always like to start and talk a little bit about that. And Dr. Glenn Aiken was my predecessor here at the unit, and Tracy Hamilton's here. He's also integral to this program, and they've studied a lot of different strategies that are now implemented on farms to be able to combat fescue toxicosis. And some of these are chaparral herbicide treatment to be able to reduce fescue seed heads, which has led to some really great improvements in average daily gain, and soy hull supplementation, other supplementation methods to mitigate fescue toxicosis. And so all of these are quality and very effective means to reduce fescue toxicosis on farms. And so today I'm just going to be sharing with you a little bit how red clover might fit into that as well. So there's been a lot of research. There's been a lot of evidence that red clover or other clovers can mitigate fescue toxicosis. And typically this has been attributed to dilution of the ergot alkaloids in the diet because the animals have more to eat. They can eat more clover instead of eating hot fescue, or they're getting more crude protein that's allowing them to better deal with that fescue. However, is it really all dilution, or is it vasorelaxation based on what we know about these isoflavones? And so these are two images using our Doppler ultrasound that we look at these blood vessels to determine if an animal is suffering from fescue toxicosis. On the left, you can see that the artery is very, very small, and this is similar to what it would look like when the animal's consuming alkaloids and are suffering from vasoconstriction. And on the right, we have an open artery, and so this is a normal animal that's not suffering from fescue toxicosis. And also, what these isoflavones would do. They turn around this animal with this constricted artery to have vasodilation. So this is a difficult concept to kind of think about, and so when I explain this, I like to think about it in terms of a milkshake. So when an animal is suffering from fescue toxicosis, their arteries are the size of coffee stirrers as opposed to milkshake straws. So your animal, when it's healthy and happy on the pasture, they have all their blood flowing through a milkshake straw. When they go out and they eat hot fescue, it turns into a coffee stir. So imagine how much more pressure that is and how much more work it is for that blood to travel throughout the body and thermoregulate and help them deal with heat, and also just transport of nutrients and helping with their ability to utilize those feeds. And so I don't know about you, in a healthy human being, we're looking for a milkshake straw when we get a milkshake, right? And so we want our cattle to have the same opportunity to be able to transport their nutrients and be healthy. So we've looked at several strategies to deliver red clover to be able to see these same benefits. And so the most obvious and first strategy that we tested, and Dr. Aiken actually was really part of, was looking at overseeding red clover on hot fescue pastures to see if we can improve fescue toxicosis. And so he established 30 to 50% stands, which is pretty typical here, and then he also fertilized the pastures that didn't receive red clover, and so those were actually very similar in nutrient content at the end of the day. And so what he saw was that the red clover was able to increase vasodilation, likely because of those isoflavones, and also improved average daily gain 100%. So the animals were gaining about a pound on the hot fescue pastures a day with no supplementation, but were gaining 2 pounds with that red clover. So another question that we had was, can we dial this down lower? Do we really need that much red clover in the diet? As I had talked to you about, when we talk about functional feeds, we're often talking about a very small amount providing that health benefit. And so we followed this up with a study where we supplemented red clover hay at 15 and 30% of the diet. And what we found was that both levels, even lower levels, were able to increase vasodilation and also increase average daily gain in the same manner as what we saw in the other study. And that was pretty exciting because we didn't think, given lower levels, that we'd be able to see these benefits. And so as part of presenting this work and talking to stakeholders and producers, one of the biggest questions we were being asked was, does it have to be red clover? I use soybean meal, or I have soy hulls in my diet, or I have other legumes in my pasture. Aren't they doing the same thing? And so what we did is we did a little study, and it was actually with goats, where we challenged them with fescue seed and looked at their blood vessels to see if we could use soybean meal, white clover, or red clover to get the same response. And what we found was that they all worked. So yes, they all do it. And so the really interesting part of this study was that they're very different in the isoflavones that they contain. So soybean meal versus red clover has a completely different profile of isoflavones, and all of these isoflavones act differently. And so this was interesting to see. But most interestingly, we saw that white clover worked, and so the big difference between red clover and white clover is that white clover has 200 times less isoflavones as part of the plant, and so it's delivering a much lower level than the red clover supplementation. And so that got us thinking, well, we don't need barely any of these isoflavones to see vasodilation to mitigate fescue toxicosis. So how else could we deliver this that might be useful for our producers? So how low can we go? And so this led us to a study working with Berkman Nutrition, evaluating the possible use of putting this red clover material in mineral. And so most producers put out a loose mineral on a regular basis in their operations, and so we thought if you didn't want to put red clover in your pasture, you might be willing to feed a red clover mineral on your hot fescue pastures. And so this study was in the pens, and what we tested was either a 0, 10, 15, or 20% weight per weight clover mineral. And the first thing I want to point out to you is that the 20% mineral, it's kind of hard to see on this screen, but it looks like feed. There's a lot of forage material in there because the red clover is really light. But we did do a study where we looked at intake, and we saw that those animals were consuming that mineral the same as the control mineral, so no issues related to them just going out and eating all of the mineral in the mineral feeder. And what we found was that with the 0% mineral, or our control, where we didn't have any red clover, we saw vasoconstriction with this challenge, just like we would expect with fescue toxicosis. But all 3 of the treatments were able to mitigate vasoconstriction. All 3 of those treatments completely reversed fescue toxicosis. And so this was particularly interesting in that we really didn't expect this to happen, but really neat that a very low level could have all of these benefits. Now, as part of this study, we noticed that in general, the 20% treatment was most effective. We saw it over the course of the experiment on every day, completely mitigating this, while we saw some differences in the lower level treatments. And so we decided to move forward with this mineral formulation. So the last thing I want to share with you today is some work that has come after that. And so another question that we get a lot when we talk about isoflavones is their phytoestrogenic potential. So like I said, these are also phytoestrogens. Do they impact fertility in our heifers and in our cows? And that would be a major concern related to their implementation. And so we went ahead and decided to go ahead and test this red clover mineral and look also at its impact on fertility. And we did this again with Berkman Nutrition, but also with Kentucky Beef Network. And Becky and Dan are both here and greeted you at the front table today. And they're integral to the success of this study. And we conducted it at Eden Shale Farm. And some of you guys may have been to Eden Shale Farm for a field day or another producer type tour. If you haven't, I would encourage you to go. It's an excellent place, and we're lucky to be able to collaborate with them and do projects there. But they've got these paddocks that have really, really hot fescue, and so we decided to go ahead and try with their heifers to see if we could see any differences with this red clover mineral versus a conventional mineral that didn't have any red clover in it. So these are just preliminary results of the first 2 years. These studies take a very long time to get enough data, but I think these are pretty exciting, so I wanted to share with you. We saw that mineral intake over these years was about 5 ounces per head per day, which is right within that range we like to target. Body weight was about 833 pounds on average, which was partly biased by some really big heifers last year that bumped that body weight up. And body condition was about 6 to 7, which is pretty good for what we're looking for, and this was maintained regardless of treatment. In terms of fertility, we didn't see any major impact to this point of the red clover mineral on having any negative impacts on heifer fertility and their ability to breed related to that, but those data are still coming in and will continue for several years. Some of the other measures that we took that relate to fescue toxicosis are hair coat scores. So a lot of times we see shaggy hair coats on our fescue cattle, and so we wanted to know if this red clover mineral could change that, could allow them to sleek off better. And what we saw was that over time, the red clover mineral consuming heifers in the red bar had a reduction in hair coat score, and we saw the same thing in the control, But overall, we saw that the red clover animals had a little bit more change in their hair coat score in opposed to the control animals, indicating that this red clover mineral might be helping them sleek off a little bit in that hot weather. So the other aspect that we were interested in was heat stress. That's one of the major factors that we see with fescue toxicosis, animals standing in ponds or standing in bodies of water covered in mud trying to cool off because of that vasoconstriction. And so what we saw when we looked at respiration rate is just how many times they breathe in a minute, are they panting type measurement in these heifers, is we saw that in both cases as the year went on and temperatures got hotter, we saw an increase in respiration rate, but we saw that the red clover heifers had reduced respiration rates in comparison to the control animals, indicating that perhaps we were seeing an alleviation of heat stress with this mineral. And in relation to that, we saw that these animals were more vasodilated. So we believe that this vasodilation that's occurring with the red clover mineral is allowing them to reduce heat stress and to have a little bit better performance on these pastures. So again, back to our milkshake straws, essentially what this red clover mineral is doing is opening them up to have a milkshake straw size artery as opposed to a coffee stir, and so they're doing a lot better, and hopefully these results will continue in our future years. So what's next? Some of the questions that we're planning to answer is optimum source and concentration. So are there other legumes at lower levels that we can utilize to get the same benefit? Which isoflavones are most important? That's really important when selecting which legume would be most effective. Different routes of supplementation. We have researchers that are working on ear implants. We've talked about lick tubs, pellets, other delivery options that could be used by producers. We have some legume variety trials with Dr. Ray Smith, who you might have seen yesterday, potentially, looking at these isoflavone levels in different varieties to see if there are some recommendations related to that. And then any other potential applications like what I'm describing here in terms of reducing heat stress. So final point being, going back to this idea of functional feeds, comparing something like alfalfa and red clover. So typically, we see that alfalfa has really low levels of isoflavones, but obviously is a very important high-protein forage that's utilized, while red clover might have some of those same benefits, but also contains isoflavones that might have these functional feed type advantages. So when we think about alfalfa, typically we think of it as a feedstuff, while red clover, I would argue, is more of a functional forage. So with that, I really appreciate your attention, and thank you for allowing me to share a little bit of our research today, and I'll take any questions. I've also included my contact information on this slide. If there's anything that stands out to you or anything of interest related to this topic, feel free to contact me at any time. And again, thank you for your time today.
I was just wondering if you measured the concentration of the isoflavones in the leaves of red clover versus the stems?
Yes, so we have done that, and actually I didn't specify the mineral is made from red clover leaf. So Tracy Hamilton in the front row has the pleasure of taking red clover hay and shaking out the leaves because they're so much higher in isoflavones. So when you look at the stem, it's almost double the concentration in the leaf. And so, yes, there's some really big differences depending on plant part. We have not had any trouble with bloat related to this. It is another point of concern. However, there is some research that's coming up soon where we're going to look at actually isoflavones for controlling bloat. There's some data that suggests that potentially these isoflavones might actually, in fact, be good for reducing bloat, and so higher isoflavone-related clovers might have reduced bloat incidence as opposed to something like white clover. But we're going to be working on that, yes.
Increased costs on the mineral that you're adding this to these ingredients, like how much cost?
That is a really good question. So I get asked all the time, is there a red clover mineral that I can buy, and what's the increased cost? And so I don't have that answer at this point. We're certainly looking for the least cost opportunity for that supplementation to be able to do. and add those isoflavones. Obviously, the purified compounds, which is what was most attractive to our collaborators for developing the mineral, are extremely expensive, and so that's really not an option. And so we're looking at some of these alternatives like red clover leaf, but we do not have a cost estimate on that. But I don't imagine it will fall much outside of any other medicated type mineral. That would be the goal. Yes, sir. So he asked how much variation there is between different red clover varieties. We've done some research in the past. One of our plant scientists in the unit has done some evaluation, and she's seen very little variation related to variety. And so we anticipate not seeing a very great deal of variety in our testing that we have upcoming. However, we do think things like seasonality and environmental conditions are probably going to have some effects on isoflavone levels, and so we'll be studying that. Yes, sir.
On the 20% on the mineral that is 20%, what is that 20%? Is that 20% of actual red clover leaf or 20% of something y'all distilled down or concentrated?
Just plain old red clover leaf. So the stuff that Tracy shook out, the hay, it had a little bit of stem but a lot of leaf. We ground it up into a finer particle size to mix in the mineral, and it was weight to weight. So 1 ounce of red clover leaf to 4 ounces of mineral.
So 1 ounce of red clover leaf is having that kind of effect.
Yep. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Not expected, certainly. Yeah. In seed, that really hasn't been evaluated, sir, and it has been brought up. People have talked about that. From what I have seen in terms of some evaluation, it's very low in seed, and so that probably won't end up being an opportunity. Although, as you can see, we don't need a whole lot to get benefits when it relates to vasoconstriction, so perhaps that's a good option. And we've talked a little bit about doing some seed analysis as part of this study as well. Certainly.
The study that you did with soybean meal, white clover, red clover, how much soybean meal did y'all put in that study, and would that potentially be we can't get it into a mineral, could we add a small amount of soybean meal potentially to a supplement and maybe get some benefit that way?
I believe she asked if we could use soybean meal potentially as just a supplement, and I believe what those goats were fed, and note it was goats, not cattle, and we haven't done it yet to look at cattle and these other options, but it was 0.5% of body weight. So it was a pretty typical supplementation rate of a concentrate or a protein supplement, and we were able to see these benefits. And they were all included at the same amount, so they were all included at 0.5% of body weight, and they all worked. So certainly I think that there's a lot of potential for that as well. And a lot of people are already doing that, right? They're already supplementing on their fescue pastures. It's just possible that these isoflavones might have more of a benefit than maybe just dilution. Yeah. Ideally, you are, and we haven't tested that as it relates to these isoflavones specifically, but I believe based on these data, it's pretty likely that that's what is happening, that it's partly dilution, as we've always expected, but that you are killing two birds with one stone. You're reducing the effect of the fescue toxicosis, you're reducing heat stress, and you're also filling that gap where you need that. I imagine so. So one of the big questions we still have with this isoflavone fescue toxicosis hypothesis is related to these different isoflavones and how they impact vasodilation, specifically. And so, like I said, soybean meal versus red clover have very different compositions of isoflavones. And some of those that are in soybean meal have been shown to have vasodilatory effects in humans. So I anticipate you would see the same thing. But yes, I think I would, if I were to venture to guess without doing the research, I would say yes, I think you're correct. Yeah.